The fishing line was nearly invisible in the shallows. Thin, colorless, wound into the mud like something the river had tried to digest and abandoned, just another piece of what people left behind when they were finished with a place. Matteo almost walked past it. He had covered this stretch of the Tarcole's riverbank hundreds of times, and the eye learns, over years, to filter out what doesn't belong. But something made him slow, not a sound, not movement, the opposite of movement, a stillness that sat wrong against the ordinary stillness of the morning. He stopped. Wedged between two exposed roots at the water's edge, half submerged in the dark shallows, lay a baby crocodile. It was no longer than his forearm, perhaps 30 centimeters. No more, its tiny body coiled in on itself in a way that looked almost peaceful until Matteo crouched low and looked closer. The fishing line had wrapped around its midsection and left rear leg in several tight loops, cutting into the skin near the base of the tail. One back leg hung at an angle that it shouldn't. The jaw rested open slightly, not in warning, not in display, but in the particular slackness of an animal that has exhausted every option and arrived, finally, at the doorstep of giving up. The chest moved, barely, a faint, uneven rise, almost imperceptible against the background motion of the river. Matteo set his field pack down without a sound. The morning was overcast, the light flat and gray in the way it gets before the dry season sun eventually burns through. The Tarcoles moved behind him, with its usual brown indifference, wide and slow and heavy with sediment from the highlands. The air smelled of wet vegetation and river silt, and the faint iron smell that large rivers carry, something ancient and mineral and indifferent to small emergencies. Herons stood motionless in the far shallows. A kingfisher traced a low, straight line above the water and disappeared around a bend of mangrove root. None of it paused for what was happening at the bank's edge. Matteo had been a wildlife ranger for 11 years. He had encountered crocodiles throughout that entire time, sometimes from respectful distances, sometimes from uncomfortably close ones. He understood what they were and what they were not. They were not dangerous because they were malicious. They were dangerous the way any apex predator is dangerous, because they were efficient, because they were patient, and because they operated entirely outside any negotiation with human concern. The communities along this river had learned to live beside them, the way you learn to live beside any force that cannot be reasoned with carefully, at distance, with a steady respect that never fully relaxed. A baby crocodile, 3 weeks old and barely breathing, was something else entirely. He did not reach for it immediately. He remained crouched at the water's edge for a long moment, watching the faint movement of its side, checking the angle of its eye. The eye was open, gold-brown and ancient-looking, even in something so new to the world, and it tracked him slowly as he shifted his weight. There was no thrashing, no attempt to move toward the water. Either it lacked the strength, or some deeper instinct had already begun the process of letting the body rest. Matteo reached into his pack and pulled out a pair of thick handling gloves. Beside them, he kept a strip of soft cloth wrap he used for injured birds, something to support a body without compressing it, to keep a frightened animal still without restraining it into greater panic. He moved without hurry. His motions were deliberate and small. Each one announced to the animal's awareness before it arrived. He kept his profile low, his breathing steady. When he finally brought his hands beneath the crocodile's body, he supported it fully, one hand under the chest, one cradling the rear before he lifted. The animal's eye widened briefly. A low, dry exhale escaped the open jaw, something between a hiss and a sigh, and then it stilled. It weighed almost nothing. That was the first thing Matteo noticed, the absence of weight, the terrible lightness of something that should have grown heavier by now if things had gone differently. He could feel the faint pulse of warmth through the cloth, the shallow tension of a body that was still, despite everything, choosing to continue. He wrapped it carefully and held it against his forearm. "Easy," he said, quietly, almost to himself. He began walking back along the bank toward his truck, the river moving behind him without acknowledgement. The herons remained in their stations. The kingfisher did not return. The morning continued in the way mornings continue without any awareness that something small and consequential had just been altered. In the village nearest this stretch of river, crocodiles were spoken of the way weather is spoken of as a condition of life, something that shaped behavior without being invited to. Mothers called children back from the water's edge, not with explanations, but with the particular tone that means, There are things in the world that don't care about you. Fishermen were pragmatic. They lost lines, occasionally nets, rarely more than that, and they moved on with the matter-of-fact resilience of people who had never expected the river to owe them anything. Matteo had grown up in one of those villages. He had learned the same lessons, spoken the same warnings, carried the same clear-eyed respect for what the river held. None of that prepared him for what it felt like to hold one of those creatures in the cup of cloth against his forearm, to feel how little it weighed, how slowly it breathed, how the eye tracked him with that quiet, ancient attention that did not know how to ask for help and was not asking. It was simply still alive. That was all it was doing, remaining alive by the smallest possible margin until something changed. He placed it in a ventilated transport box in the back of his truck with a folded cloth beneath it and a damp towel draped loosely across the top to maintain warmth and reduce stress. He drove slowly on the rutted track toward the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, taking the curves carefully, avoiding the worst of the potholes. It was a small thing to do. It was the only thing to do. He did not think of it yet as something he would remember. He did not imagine returning to this bank 7 years later, or standing in a plastic chair outside the same wildlife center answering questions from journalists. He did not think about the river keeping any kind of record, or about the particular quality of scar tissue left by monofilament fishing line, or about the way gold-brown eyes look when they are watching you from the surface of a flooded river, years after you first saw them watching you from a root-tangled bank at dawn. He only thought about the road, about the speed, about keeping the box still in the back, about getting there before whatever margin remained between this animal and the end of it had finally, quietly, closed. The river fell away behind him as he drove. The gray morning stretched ahead, and in the box in the back of his truck, the baby crocodile breathed shallowly, unevenly, but continuously, as if it, too, was simply waiting to see what came next. The Wildlife Center received the crocodile without ceremony. That was the right word for it, without ceremony, because that was how Dr. Reyes operated, and it was one of the things Matteo had always respected about her. She did not exclaim over the animal or recoil from it. She simply cleared a section of the examination table, pulled on her gloves, and began assessing with the quiet focus of someone who had spent years learning to set her own reactions aside in favor of what was actually needed. The fishing line had caused circulatory damage to the left rear leg. The wound site at the base of the tail showed the early stages of infection, not advanced, but present, and in an animal this small, even a modest infection carried real weight. The crocodile was severely dehydrated, its skin lacking the subtle elasticity of a healthy hatchling, its movements reduced to the occasional slow blink and a faint repositioning of the jaw. Dr. Reyes estimated its age at no more than 3 weeks. She administered fluids carefully and cleaned the wound with slow, methodical attention, her hands moving without hesitation but never with force. Matteo stood at the edge of the room and watched. He told himself, as he often did in these situations, that he was there for documentation purposes. Rangers sometimes stayed through initial assessments to provide field context where the animal was found, what the surrounding habitat suggested, whether there were signs of a nest nearby. He had found no signs of a nest. He provided that information when asked and then remained, arms folded, watching the warming lamp cast its orange glow over the small, still form on the table. The crocodile's eye stayed open throughout. It tracked movement in the room. Dr. Reyes's hands, the overhead light, the slow shift of Matteo's weight from one foot to the other with the same steady, unwavering attention that crocodilians carry from birth, as if the world were a single, continuous problem to be observed and catalogued. It did not struggle. It lay on the table with a stillness that had moved, over the past hour, from the stillness of near death into something slightly different, the stillness of an animal that was present, aware, and waiting. Dr. Reyes set up a shallow rehabilitation tank in the center's recovery area, warm water, clean substrate, a section of dry platform where the animal could rest above the waterline. She placed the crocodile in without comment, and it settled immediately into the shallows, motionless except for the quiet movement of its breathing. The bad leg drifted slightly behind it, not yet willing to bear weight. By the second day, children had begun appearing at the low fence that bordered the recovery enclosure. Word traveled through small communities the way it always does, not through announcements, but through the specific speed of something genuinely worth seeing. They came in twos and threes after school, pressing their faces between the fence rails, speaking in lowered voices that still managed to carry. They pointed at the tank. They asked questions Mateo didn't always have complete answers for. One girl, perhaps 7 years old, with serious eyes and sandals caked in dried mud, looked at the crocodile floating motionless in its shallow water and said the word plainly, as if the animal had arrived already carrying it. Cocodrilo. Just that, matter of fact, accurate and somehow exactly right. No one argued with it. The name settled over the recovery enclosure like something that had always been there. Mateo began arriving each morning before his patrol rounds. He brought small pieces of tilapia, which he offered on the end of a blunt feeding stick, lowering them into the water at the same position and at the same hour each day. Consistency was the first vocabulary of trust between a wild animal and a human presence, not kindness, not gentleness in any sentimental sense, but the simple reliability of a pattern the animal could begin to predict. If a thing arrives at the same time and in the same way, and does not cause harm, the body's alert systems gradually adjust their threshold. This was not taming. It was something quieter and more honest than that. The first week, Cocodrilo ignored the tilapia entirely. He floated in the shallows with his jaw slightly parted, taking fluids from the dropper. Dr. Reyes administered twice daily, allowing the wound to be cleaned with the endurance of something that had stopped spending energy on resistance. The leg began to show improvement, the darkest discoloration fading to a duller bruise, the swelling receding by careful degrees. The second week, he ate. Not immediately, not eagerly, but with the slow deliberation of an animal re-establishing its relationship with appetite. He took the first piece of tilapia sideways, without surfacing fully, and retreated immediately to the far edge of the tank. Mateo noted it in his field log without elaboration. Animal accepted first feeding, 0720 hours. The infection cleared by the end of the third week. Dr. Reyes adjusted the treatment plan, reduced the dropper sessions, and told Mateo with characteristic directness that the leg would likely heal with some permanent drag on land, but that in water where a crocodile of this species spent the majority of its life, the impact would be minimal. "He'll be fine," she said, washing her hands at the utility sink. "He'll be slow on a bank. In the river, you won't see any difference." Mateo nodded and returned to the enclosure. It was sometime during the fourth week that he noticed the change. He could not have said precisely which morning it happened, only that there was a morning when he arrived at the tank and Cocodrilo did not submerge. Other staff members approached and the crocodile retreated to the murky edge, pressing low against the substrate in the instinctive withdrawal of a wild animal maintaining its margins. The children came and it sank. Dr. Reyes came and it held at the far end, jaw closed, watching. But when Mateo arrived at the same hour, in the same quiet, with the same feeding stick and the same small offering of fish, Cocodrilo remained at the surface, still, watching, not approaching, not softening in any way that could be called warmth, simply choosing, in whatever way a 3-week-old crocodile chooses anything, not to leave. Mateo mentioned it once to Dr. Reyes, not as a remarkable thing, but as an observable one. She listened without surprise. "He knows your pattern isn't a threat," she said. "That's all it is." "I know," Mateo said. He stood at the tank's edge for a moment longer, the feeding stick resting across his palm, watching the gold-brown eye just above the waterline. The eye was steady, ancient-looking, entirely unreadable and entirely present. It was not friendship. It was not recognition in any way that science would confirm with certainty. It was only this, that when Mateo was near, the crocodile stayed, and in the careful, unsentimental language of wild things in the world where trust is not given but simply, slowly, withheld less, that was already something. That was already more than either of them had started with. The decision to release Cocodrilo was not made on a single morning. It arrived the way most difficult decisions arrive gradually, through the accumulation of smaller observations that eventually added up to something undeniable. Dr. Reyes noted it first in her records. Weight gain consistent, wound site fully closed, hydration normal, feeding response strong and self-directed. The leg dragged slightly on the dry platform when Crocodile hauled himself out of the water to bask. But in the water where he spent the better part of each day, his movement had become fluid and purposeful, the natural ease of a body finally operating within the element it was designed for. He was not the animal Matteo had carried from the riverbank 2 months ago. That animal had been disappearing. This one was arriving. Matteo sat with the release date for 3 days before he wrote it into the schedule. He chose a section of the river upstream from the main village, away from the tourist boat routes and the heaviest fishing activity. He had walked it twice that week during his morning patrols, reading the mud and the vegetation for what it could tell him, checking for signs of larger territorial animals, assessing the bank cover, the depth of the shallows near the reed line. It was good habitat, sheltered without being isolated. The kind of place a young crocodile could establish margins quietly, without immediate contest. He chose dawn, for the same reason. Rangers always choose dawn for releases, not for any poetic reason, though the light at that hour on the Tarcoles carried a quality that made even practical decisions feel weighted. Dawn meant cooler temperatures, reduced boat traffic, lower human activity along the banks. It meant the animal could orient itself in relative stillness before the day imposed its noise. Dr. Reyes came with one assistant. Matteo arrived first, alone, in his truck, and stood at the bank for a few minutes before the others reached him. The river was pale copper in the early light, the mist sitting low over the surface in thin, barely moving layers. The smell of the water was strong, wet stone and green decay, and the deep mineral presence of something that had been moving through this landscape for longer than the concept of a landscape existed. A single egret stood in the shallows 20 meters upstream, white and absolutely still, as if it had been placed there. The transport crate was carried down to the bank's edge and set on the mud. Dr. Reyes crouched and unfastened the latch without ceremony. Crocodile emerged the way he had increasingly done everything over the past 2 weeks, with direction. He moved forward out of the crate, paused at the threshold where the mud met the water, and held there for a moment. His head was low, his jaw closed. The bad leg found its placement in the soft bank. He was still for 2 full seconds, perhaps 3, while the river moved past him with complete indifference to his arrival. Then he slipped beneath the surface. A brief disturbance of water, a small displacement of mud at the bank's edge, and then nothing. The river resumed its face, brown, wide, and quiet. The ripples spread and dissolved. The egret upstream did not move. "Good," Matteo said. The word came out smaller than he intended. He was not sure who he said it to. He stood at the bank for a long time afterward. There was no protocol for this part. The documentation was complete, coordinates logged, animal condition noted, release time recorded. Everything that needed to be written down had been written down. But he stayed anyway, watching the surface of the water where Crocodile had entered, as if the river might offer something back. It did not. The water moved. The mist thinned as the morning warmed. Somewhere in the mangroves behind him, a bird called in a short, repetitive pattern and then stopped. Dr. Reyes passed him on her way back to the truck, carrying the empty crate. Her hand rested briefly on his shoulder as she went by. She did not say anything. There was a particular kind of silence between people who work with wild animals long enough, a shared understanding that some moments don't require comment, that the attempt to name what you're feeling in these situations usually diminishes it. Matteo returned to his patrol route. He completed his rounds. He filed the release documentation that evening in the small office at the center, filling each field carefully with the facts of what had happened. The form asked for coordinates, species, age estimate, condition at release. It did not ask what it felt like to watch something you had carried in a cloth against your forearm disappear into a river without looking back. That was not a field that existed, and perhaps that was right. Perhaps some things are better carried than recorded. The months passed the way months pass when you return to routine, not slowly, not quickly, but with the ordinary momentum of days that have purpose. Other rescues came. A juvenile iguana with a broken spine that healed more completely than anyone expected. 2 ocelot cubs found after their mother was killed on the highway, thin and loud with hunger, requiring weeks of round-the-clock feeding before they were ready for the transition enclosure. A river otter tangled in a gill net, which did not survive despite everything Dr. Reyes attempted, and which Matteo drove home thinking about for several days after. He stopped walking the section of the bank where he had made the release. This was not a conscious decision. It simply happened. His patrol routes shifted with the seasonal changes in wildlife activity, and that particular stretch fell into a gap between his regular circuits. He did not seek it out. He told himself this was practical. The river had no obligation to show him anything, and he had no right to expect it. A year passed. Then two. He heard reports, occasionally sightings of a large crocodile in the mid-river section with a distinctive scar along the jaw, noted by a pair of wildlife researchers conducting a population survey. He read the survey report when it circulated through the regional ranger network. He noted the scar location, left jaw, mid-length, pale and smooth against the surrounding scale pattern, and he set the report down on his desk and returned to whatever he had been doing before. He did not follow up on it. He did not visit the survey site or ask the researchers for photographs. He completed his shift, drove home through the last of the afternoon light, and ate his dinner watching the shadows lengthen across the yard. The river was 30 kilometers away and moving at its own pace through its own world, carrying its sediment and its silences and everything that lived within it forward through time, with complete indifference to what any individual human did or did not let himself wonder about. Matteo knew this. He had always known this. He had spent 11 years learning the particular discipline of caring about wild things without requiring anything back from them, without making his care conditional on acknowledgement or continuity or the comfort of knowing how the story ended. He was good at it, mostly. Most days, he was very good at it. Some mornings, standing at a different stretch of the same river, watching the surface for whatever it chose to show him, he was only almost good at it. The water moved. The years moved with it, and somewhere in the deep brown current of the Tarcoles, something with a pale scar on its jaw grew slowly, steadily into its full inheritance. 7 years is a long time in any life. In the life of an American crocodile, it is the passage from hatchling to something formidable, a body that has tripled in length, that has learned the full geography of its territory, that carries its authority not through aggression but through sheer, settled presence. The surveys that had tracked a large, scarred male in the mid-Tarcoles section over those years documented a crocodile that had established a range of several kilometers, that fed reliably and avoided conflict with other large males through the quiet assertion of a dominant animal that does not need to prove itself. He appeared in the survey photographs as something ancient and complete, 4 meters of compressed patience, moving through the river the way the river itself moved, as if he and it were the same continuous thing. The rainy season that 7th year was severe. The storms came in from the Pacific in long, heavy succession, each one pushing more water down from the highlands than the river could absorb without consequence. By the 3rd week of October, the Tarcoles had risen nearly 2 meters above its dry season level. The banks had disappeared under slow, red-brown floodwater. The reeds were submerged. The mangrove roots stood in water up to their mid-trunks, the familiar landmarks of the river's edge erased and replaced with an expanse of moving water that looked deceptively calm from a distance and was anything but. The footbridge had been a seasonal crossing, a narrow wooden structure that the village used during the dry months as a shortcut between the eastern fields and the school road. It should not have been in use during flood conditions. The warnings had been given, but warnings and the decisions of children exist in different registers, and on a Tuesday afternoon, a group of 5 children used the bridge as they had used it many times before, because it had always held, because the school day had been long, because the quickest way home was the quickest way home. The bridge gave way at its eastern support. 3 children fell into the current. The witnesses on the bank described the next minutes in the gathered testimonies with a consistency that investigators later noted was unusual for events of high stress, where memory typically fractures and diverges. They agreed on the sequence. They agreed on the details. What they did not agree on, what none of them could settle into comfortable language about, was the meaning of what they saw. The current had carried the children approximately 15 meters downstream before the crocodile surfaced. He came up slowly, without the explosive breach of an animal in pursuit. He appeared at the center of the river the way large crocodiles appear when they are not hunting, a gradual materialization, the long dark shape rising through turbid water until the head and the ridged spine were visible above the surface. He was enormous. Even people who had lived beside this river their entire lives and knew what its crocodiles looked like felt the scale of him differently in that moment. 4 meters of animal in a flooded river, 30 meters from 3 struggling children, moving without urgency in their direction. The people on the bank went silent. Several began moving toward the water's edge without any clear plan, driven by the same helpless momentum that disaster produces in witnesses. The crocodile did not accelerate. He moved at the same measured pace, cutting across the current rather than with it, and positioned himself between the children and the deeper central channel, the part of the river where the flood current was strongest, where the water moved fast enough to pull under anything that could not fight it. His body settled perpendicular to the flow, and he held there, in the churning, swollen river. The stillness of him was extraordinary. The water broke against his flanks and moved past him as if around a fixed object, as if he were part of the river's architecture rather than a creature within it. The children moved away from him. This was instinct, immediate and correct. They scrambled in the water, arms working, bodies angling toward the near bank because the near bank was away from what had surfaced. And the near bank, in that section of the river, was the shallow side. It was the side where the flood water was chest deep on an adult rather than bottomless. It was the side where the adults on the bank could reach them. The crocodile moved with them, not toward them, not in any motion that could be described as pursuit, but as the children moved, he adjusted his position always to the channel side, always between them and the deep current, so that the geometry of the river, in those minutes, offered the children only one direction that was not blocked by either the current or the animal. That direction was the bank. It took 4 minutes. Later, when the testimonies were gathered and the timeline reconstructed, that was the number that appeared most consistently. 4 minutes between the bridge collapse and the moment the last child was pulled from the shallows by the arms of the adults who had waded in from the bank. The crocodile held at the surface throughout. His jaw was closed, his eye visible above the waterline. Gold brown and absolutely steady faced the bank where the children were being lifted from the water, wrapped in jackets, held against chests. He remained there for a moment that the witnesses struggled to assign a duration to long enough to be noticed, not long enough to be explained. Then he submerged. The water closed over the pale scar along his left jaw, over the long dark ridge of his spine, over everything. The river resumed its surface, churning and brown and carrying its flood load toward the coast without pause or acknowledgement. On the bank, no one spoke for a moment. The children were crying and coughing and alive. The adults who had waded in were pulling them up the muddy slope, and the people who had stood watching from the bank were only now beginning to move again, to reach forward, to say the things that people say when the worst has not happened. One woman, standing at the bank's edge, was looking at the place where the crocodile had been. She had her hand pressed against her mouth. She was not crying. She was simply looking at the water as if it had just told her something she did not have a word for. A man standing beside her had taken a photograph. He did not remember deciding to take it. He only became aware of it afterward, a photograph on his phone of a wide flooded river, 3 small figures in the water, and just beyond them, between them and the deeper channel, the unmistakable outline of something large and still, its pale jaw scar bright and clear, even through the murk of the floodwater. He posted it that evening with a short description of what had happened, not expecting it to go anywhere. By morning, it had traveled further than the river ever would. The photograph reached places the river never would. Within 24 hours, it had been shared across platforms in 17 countries, attached to headlines in languages the village had no particular relationship with, accompanied by the kind of breathless framing that large events attract when they arrive without clean explanation. The image itself was not dramatic by the standards of what circulates: no blood, no collision, no moment of visible danger. Just a wide brown river swollen with flood rain, 3 small figures in the water, and between them and the deeper current, the long, unmistakable outline of a very large crocodile, pale scar visible along the jaw, body perpendicular to the flow, holding still. That stillness was what people could not stop looking at. The researchers arrived within the week. They came from 2 universities and a regional wildlife institute, carrying equipment and credentials, and the careful, precise vocabulary of people whose professional lives are organized around the discipline of not overstating what the evidence shows. They were not dismissive. They were thorough. They set camera traps along the flood zone banks, collected behavioral data from the witness testimonies, cross-referenced the scar identification against the survey photographs accumulated over 7 years of population monitoring in that river section. The identification was confirmed without dispute. The animal in the photograph was the same animal that had appeared in the survey records since year 2 of its documented range establishment. The scar was consistent, the size was consistent, the territory was consistent. What the evidence could not confirm, and what the researchers were careful to say plainly in their preliminary report, was intent. Crocodilian behavior in flood conditions was documented but not fully understood. Large animals moved into shallower marginal zones during high water events for reasons related to prey distribution and territorial maintenance. A crocodile positioning its body in moving water was not inherently purposeful in any directional sense. The current itself created drift patterns, and a large, stationary animal in a strong current would naturally influence the movement of smaller objects nearby. The children's instinctive movement away from the animal toward the bank was self-directed and explicable without attributing guidance to the crocodile. These were reasonable statements. They were published in careful language and defended in interviews with patience and precision. Most of the scientific community accepted them as the most defensible position given available data. The photograph continued to circulate. The journalists came after the researchers, which was the usual order of things, and they came with different needs. They needed a person. A story requires a person at its center, and the facts of what had happened pointed, eventually, back through 7 years of river records, to a regional wildlife ranger who had filed a crocodile rescue report on a gray morning in early November, 11 years into his career, noting the coordinates of a fishing line entanglement and the condition of a hatchling at time of recovery. The name on the report was Mateo's. The journalists found him without much difficulty. He gave one interview. He had agreed to it partly because declining had begun to feel like its own kind of statement, and partly because a colleague had told him, not unkindly, that someone was going to tell this story regardless, and it was better told by someone who had actually been present for its beginning. He sat in a plastic chair outside the wildlife center in the late afternoon. The light at that hour came through the trees at a low angle, catching the dust in the air and making it briefly visible. He was not comfortable being recorded. He kept his hands on his knees and spoke without looking directly at the camera, as if addressing something slightly to the left of it, the river, perhaps, or the general direction of the afternoon. He described the fishing line. He described the weight of the hatchling in the cloth against his forearm, and the drive to the center with the transport box in the back of his truck, and the care he took on the curves. He described the feeding sessions, the gradual adjustment of a wild animal's alert threshold, the morning he noticed that Crocodile had stopped submerging when he approached. He described the release at dawn, the 2 seconds at the water's edge, the slide beneath the surface, the ripples dissolving. The journalist asked whether he believed the crocodile had recognized him, had remembered him in some meaningful way. Mateo was quiet for a moment. He looked at his hands. "I don't know what he remembered," he said. "I know what I did. I held something small that was alive and in trouble, and I didn't put it down." He paused. That's all it ever was. The interview was broadcast and clipped and shared alongside the photograph, and people responded to it the way people respond to things that resist the packaging they reach for instinctively. Some found in his words a confirmation of what they already believed about animals and memory, and the long record that living things keep of one another. Others found in his restraint a kind of proof that even the humans closest to the event could not claim more than the evidence gave them. Both readings were available in the same quiet sentences. That was perhaps why they traveled as far as they did. The community along the Tarcoles rebuilt the footbridge with better supports and added a weight restriction that the village agreed to observe. A small painted marker went up near the crossing, not a monument, nothing formal, just a rectangle of painted wood with the date and a few words in Spanish that translated roughly to, "Here, the river kept them." The children who had been in the water returned to school. The youngest one, when asked by her teacher some weeks later what she most clearly remembered, said she remembered the noise of the water, and then the noise being less, and something large nearby that did not come toward her. She said it the way children say things that have settled into memory without drama plainly, as a fact, as something that had happened, and was now simply part of what she knew about the world. Mateo returned to his patrol routes. The center continued its work. Other animals came through the recovery enclosure: birds, reptiles, a juvenile tapir whose mother had been struck by a vehicle on the highway and who took 6 weeks to stabilize and 3 months to release. The paperwork continued. The river continued. The dry season came and reduced the Tarcoles to its quieter self, narrower, slower, its banks reappearing from beneath the flood's residue as if the water had simply been borrowing them for a while. Crocodile was sighted twice more that season by the survey team, once in the mid-river shallows at dusk, and once resting on a high bank in the afternoon heat, jaw open to the sky, in the thermal regulation posture that large crocodiles adopt in the dry months. The scar along his jaw was visible in both photographs. He did not appear disturbed by the researchers' presence at distance. He returned to the water in his own time and was gone. The river moved through its channels the way it always had, carrying sediment, carrying time, carrying everything deposited into it downstream toward a coast that received it all without distinction. Somewhere in its middle depth, in the particular territory a large male had claimed and held for 7 years, the water moved around and past and through a world that had no need of explanation. On the bank each morning, in the gray hour before the heat arrived, Mateo walked his route. He paused sometimes at the water's edge, not waiting, not watching for anything specific, just standing the way a person stands beside something large and old and continuous, aware that it contains more than they will ever see of it. The river offered its surface, nothing more, nothing less, and in that gray, quiet, moving light, it was enough.